So I want to tell you guys about a friend of mine. I met him in the 7th grade. We were introduced and he put me in a headlock. Not the best way to meet a new friend, but he was a bit larger than I was, and I wasn't the strapping hulk of a guy that I am now. Yeah, we became good friends. Over the years, we went to the same middle school, the same high school. But this friend was unique in that he was a friend that protected me. I don't think he did it fully knowing or setting out and saying, "Hey, this Jay guy, he's a good guy, a good kid. I'm gonna protect him. I'm gonna keep him from getting into trouble." I don't think it was anything like that. But nonetheless, he did. He protected me, especially when we were in high school. Because it was this friend of mine who would always make sure that I missed the parties. Now you're thinking, what kind of a friend, causes you to miss a party? Well, this friend of mine knew where I stood. He knew what I believed. He knew I went to church. He knew that I was a Christian. He knew that I was becoming more and more passionate about following Jesus. And because of that, he protected me. He kind of made sure that I was left out of some of the activities and the events that often led students to trouble. And so I one day asked him, how come you're going to all of these parties and you're hanging out with these friends from school, but I never seem to know about the parties, and you never invite me, you never tell me. And he said, well, that's because these are the kind of parties you don't want to be at. And I realized just how important and special that friendship was. The fact that he respected what I believed, he respected who I was, and when he could, he was looking out for me. He wanted to make sure I wasn't tempted or I didn't find myself in a place that I would later regret in life. And that friendship was a pretty amazing thing for me in those years of high school. And it makes me kind of think about and wonder what it looks like for you guys to have a friend that kind of has your back, a friend that's looking out for you, protecting you, has your best interests in mind, and really cares enough about you to keep you away from the things that you could find yourself getting in trouble with. Well, that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and we're going to be back in the book of Ephesians, and we're going to look at some things that Paul writes that is going to help us think about what it might look like for us to not only do things to protect ourselves, but to protect each other. So let's do this. Let's put the video on pause, and as a small group, would you guys take a few minutes and turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to read together verses 10 through 20, and then when you're done, come on back and we'll unpack this together, okay? Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 20, and I'll see you when you come back. All right, welcome back. Well, before we actually jump into these verses, let's just take a little walk down memory lane. So we've been in the book of Ephesus, and we've been talking about what it looks like for us to have healthy relationships, that we're called to be in community. In fact, that God calls us to be in a specific or a special community, and that is the church. And in this church, in this community, everyone's invited. Jesus has tear down the walls that separate man from God and man from each other, and through Jesus we are being reconciled to God and to one another. And we're looking at Ephesians, and we're moving through this, and each week we've been learning a little bit of something different to help us think through what it looks like for us to have good, healthy relationships. Well, we've come now to chapter 6, and again, we jumped chapter 5, so you may want to go back and read through chapter 5. There's some great stuff in there that will probably be helpful for you. But we tonight are looking at chapter 6, verses 10 through 20. And really, this is kind of like Paul's final word for the Jesus followers. That he's coming to the point where he's like, okay, we've talked about all these things. Now let's see what it looks like for us to stand strong, to stand together, to actually be who we are called to be in the church. Taking all those things that we've already talked about, now that we've sorted through them, what does it look like for us to now stand strong? Now, here's where we are in this. So let's remember that Paul is writing to this group of people, and he's writing to them at a time in our history where the church was kind of really dealing with a lot of opposition, especially from Rome. And with that, there were probably soldiers filling the streets, filling the towns, and these soldiers would have been Roman soldiers, and their job was really to, one, keep the peace. Of course, that would be Roman peace. But two, in very many cases, these soldiers were actually harassing, arresting, beating, and maybe even killing some of the Jesus followers. This is the time when the church is beginning to be persecuted. The message is spreading, the church is growing, and the leadership in Rome isn't happy with all of it at this point, and so they're doing what they can to do this. And so this idea of a Roman soldier was something that for most Jesus followers probably brought an image or a feeling of fear. Like we, as Christians, we wouldn't want to have a Roman soldier show up. But yet, Paul uses this image of armor, this what the Roman soldiers would have worn. He uses this picture as a way to help the Jesus followers think through and understand what it was like for them to stand strong. And really, what we're looking for is this idea of protection for ourselves and for each other. So in these verses that you just read, we know these verses to be the verses that talk about the armor of God. And if you've been around the church for a while, you probably are familiar with these pieces of armor. But let's just talk through them really briefly here and kind of put it all together in a way that might help us understand what Paul is going for in these things. So let's look at these pieces of armor very quickly. Let's start with the belt of truth. Now, the belt of truth is to be a reminder that we're going to keep God's truth close, that someplace where we can reach it. And now, if you think about what the role of a belt is, if you wear a belt, I know some students don't wear belts because you don't really need to wear belts just yet. But when you get older, like me, you kind of you get used to wearing a belt. In fact, you kind of need a belt to help keep your pants up. But think about what the belt does. I mean, the belt really is that piece that keeps your pants up and keeps your shirt tucked in and keeps the outfit that you put together kind of finishes it up. And so for armor, that's kind of what we're looking at here with the belt of truth. That this is a piece that holds the armor in place. And it's not just that it's a belt, but that it's God's truth, and we're to keep the truth. It's kind of like saying that God's truth can protect us from all of the other things that are out there. So you have the belt, but then you also have the breastplate of righteousness. And this is a reminder for us to actually follow Jesus, not with just his words, but in our actions. That we follow Jesus not just in word, but in action. That when we choose what's wrong over what's right, we leave ourselves open and vulnerable to damage, to attacks. But when we put that breastplate of righteousness on, when we choose to do what's right over what's wrong, well, we protect ourselves from that vulnerability or that risk that we put ourselves in when we choose to do things wrong. The next thing he brings up is the shoes of peace, and he reminds us that we are to always be ready to share the good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. The shoes are this picture that when you put your shoes on, you're ready to go. Now, there were many years that I loved being barefoot. I was a lifeguard for a long time, loved being barefoot, was barefoot a lot of the time. But, after so many years of walking around barefoot, I kind of enjoy having shoes on. And I like having shoes on because when my shoes are on, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to move, I'm ready to run, I'm ready to do whatever I need to do. But without my shoes, well, I prefer to have them on because it's better to be ready. But the shoes of peace are what reminds us that we need to be ready to share the good news of Jesus. And then he moves on to the shield of faith. And the shield of faith is what keeps us protected from the lies that try to tell us that Jesus isn't who he says he is. These are the lies that come at us that what we believe really isn't worth believing, or that how we live is a weird and outdated way of living. The culture is moving to a place of all acceptance, and here we still have certain things that we don't accept. And so this shield, it protects us. That shield of faith protects us from those lies. And then he goes into the helmet of salvation. And the helmet of salvation is a reminder that we need to protect our thoughts. And actually, it's in our minds. It's the thoughts that we have. It's the things that we think about that could actually become one of our greatest battlefields. And so the shield of salvation reminds us that we need to be careful about the things that we think about the things that we hear and the things that we process in our minds, that we're to be thinking of good things, pure things, holy things. And a lot of things that we actually see and hear and take in and think about really don't fall into those categories. So the helmet of salvation helps to protect or reminds us that we need to be protecting our thoughts. And then lastly, he goes in and he shares with us the idea of the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And it's in this word of God that we find our purpose, our reason. We find out everything there is that we need to know about God and what it looks like for us to have a relationship with him, what it looks like for us to chase after Jesus. It becomes for us the foundational piece of our armor. I mean, think about it. Would you ever really go into a battle and not have your sword or a weapon? The Bible's what allows us to face our enemy, to face temptation, to resist and to walk away from those things that sometimes cause us to stumble. And I find it interesting that Paul says that we are to put on every piece of armor, that it's almost like he knew that we would forget or leave one out, or we would not put the whole armor on. Maybe we walk out one day with only the belt, or maybe another day with only the shoes. But Paul says you have to put all of the armor on. Every single piece, not just one or two, but all of the armor. And that by putting it all on, then we have the opportunity to be protected. Now, imagine going into battle and not having the armor, or maybe only wearing half the armor. I mean, we wouldn't really stand a chance if we were facing off against someone else and they were fully prepared and we weren't. I mean, even some of the best armies in the world, without their protection, wouldn't survive very long in the face of battle. We need to be protected in order for us to withstand this. Now, one more observation in all of this, and I think this is what's going to help us drive home this idea of protection, standing strong, and being able to have each other's back. Have you ever thought or noticed there's no protection for our back? We've got head, we've got chest, we've got the shield, we've got the sword, we've got the belt. We have all of those vital areas protected, but nowhere does Paul say anything about protecting our back. And I kind of like this image that we see here, because maybe it's Paul thinking that we're never meant to go into battle alone. That we should always have somebody who's going to watch our back. Someone who's going to protect us from the other side. And really, it's this idea that leads us to the big idea for this week. And the big idea is that we can stand strong together. You see, it wasn't ever God's intent for us to do any of this Jesus life by ourselves. It was always God's purpose for us to do it together. And I love the picture that we're seeing here as we think about this idea that our friends aren't just someone that we have a good time with, but that our friends are someone who are actually there to protect us, to get our back, to be there with us when we need them most. Now, we all face battles, and I don't know all the battles that you guys are facing in your life and the things that you're dealing with from a day-to-day basis. I don't know all of the challenges, but isn't it good to have somebody, a friend nearby, who kind of knows what's going on, who can be there to protect you and to encourage you and to help you along? And I think that's the ultimate picture that we're starting to see here as we looked at these verses, these chapters in Ephesians. That in order for us to have healthy, good relationships, then we really need to emulate what he says about how the church is to operate. And that when we see the church doing what the church is called to do, well, that's when we see the perfect picture that God had in mind for all of us. And so as we think through what it looks like for us to protect ourselves and protect each other, let me throw out 3 things that maybe can encourage you. First one is this: put on your armor. Now, it might sound silly to say that, but it really does make a difference in our lives. When we take the time to cover ourselves in God's protection, to put on the full armor, it really does change who we are, how we live, and how God is moving in our lives. So don't just look at this thing that Paul writes and think, oh, what a great word picture of this, but let's take it to heart. Be serious about it, and let's daily put on the full armor. Number 2, I think let's help someone else with their armor. You know, we are to do this together. And maybe there's a friend that you're thinking of that maybe you need to step up and be there for them a little bit more. Maybe there's a friend that's been stepping up for you and they've had your back in some pretty amazing ways. Maybe you need to make sure that you're doing the same for them. But help them put their armor on. You wanna help them be protected just as you are protecting yourself. And then lastly, the third thing I think we need to do as we think about all of this, and that is to pray. You know, when you look at these later verses here of what you read, Paul asks the Jesus followers to pray for him. You see, even Paul knew and understood that he needed community around himself. Paul was a guy who would travel to a city or a village, and he would help a church get started. He would share the good news of Jesus, and he would stay there for a while and help them get moving, and then he would move on to another city or to another town or to another village, and he would do the same thing. And some of that time it was just him and maybe another guy or 2 other guys that would go out and they would do this. But what Paul is saying here to the church, because remember, he's not writing this letter to a person, he's writing this letter to a group of people, the church in Ephesus, and he's saying, pray for me. You see, Paul understood that he needed community. He needed to have somebody watching his back. And so what would that look like for us? What would it look like for your small group? You know, as we get these small groups established, you guys have spent the last 3 weeks, this is the 4th week, getting to know each other and laughing and having fun and then talking through what it looks like to have good friendships. But what would it look like if you guys took the time to actually pray for each other? To pray for your friends, to pray for those in your school, Pray for your siblings, your parents, your small group leaders. What would it look like for you to be on your knees for the people in your life? If Paul was a guy who asked for it because he knew he needed it, surely we are ones who both need it and should be doing it. So put on your armor, and then help someone else put their armor on, and then commit to praying for each other. As you guys have this time now, some questions and some answers and some time talking together, I hope maybe you would take some time as a small group and think about that. What would it look like for you to commit to be praying for each other on a regular basis? All right, guys, have a great time, and we'll see you next week.